Welcome to the 14th in our series of podcasts. In this latest edition of the Encephalitis Podcast, I am so thrilled to be joined by Mike Day. Mike is a director and cinematographer whose documentaries have been highly acclaimed by audiences around the world. In 2011, he was finishing his first film, The Guga Hunters of Ness, and Mike became ill with encephalitis. He lost the ability to walk and was even told that he might not be able to work again. However, during his recovery, Mike threw himself into his next film, The Islands and the Whales, a true labour of love, which was filmed over 5 years in the Faroe Islands. And this was a film that I watched eagerly when it aired, and at that point had absolutely no idea how close my connection was with the filmmaker. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have Mike with us today to talk about his work, his recovery, and what his next plans are. So thanks so much for joining us, Mike.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great. You've been with me through the journey in many ways.
I have.
Your newsletters and Christmas cards. My mum gets your Christmas cards every year, and I have your cookbook too. So
I have been with you on this journey, and I didn't even know it when I watched the film a few years back, sat here, which we're going to come on to a little bit more. Had absolutely no idea, of course, that I'd be sat here, a few years later doing a podcast with you.
Yeah.
So anyway, welcome. Look, I'm gonna cut right into it. Whilst I was doing a bit of research for this podcast, I was really struck to discover that you were in fact a lawyer in your earlier working life. But then you left to film your first documentary. That's a huge career change. What happened? How come you made that leap?
Well, I was writing films and doing photography and doing sound engineering and music and all kinds of things before I was a lawyer. So maybe that was the diversion. It was my gap year was being a lawyer, maybe. But I really had been a jack of all trades and certainly a master of none in that period. And then cinema I fell in love with it. It embodied all of those different creative things that I was doing. Unfortunately, I discovered this while I was a lawyer. So I was at the weekends going off to make films with my brother in Scotland whenever I could. And I would get up at 6 a.m. and do an hour before work and rush home to write and edit. And I sort of tested that it wasn't just a phase. And then one day I got a camera and I quit my job and I moved to a boat in Scotland and set sail to find a story, which was naive enough that it might just work. And it did. And the BBC commissioned the film a few months later, which was a dream come true. And making the film, skipping over the making of the film is to skip over quite an ordeal because we sailed out into the North Atlantic to the last 10 men in Europe who were allowed to hunt seabirds. And I grew up sailing, as did my brother. So we were qualified skippers. My father was a seaman, so we'd done it every year. And we got the privilege to film these guys that they hadn't let anyone film them for 50 years. But then, then there was a twist, of course.
Yeah, of course. Well, look, let's talk a little bit about that film, which was, I hope you've got to correct any pronunciations I get wrong here. The Guga Hunters of Ness, right? And as you said, you followed these 10 men from the Isle of Lewis as they set sail for, and how do you pronounce this? Sulisgear?
Sulisgear, yeah.
Sulisgear, which is an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And they hunt gannets, which is this prized delicacy in Ness. So, what on earth interested you in this subject?
Well, I was initially making a less adventurous film. It was about crofting and the fact that there were all these displaced people from way back from the 18th century on the land who'd fought for the right for their patch on its earth to be protected and not to be exploited, and not to have rent driven up and pushed off their land. And that's what crofting was. And it kind of gone full circle. And in the aftermath of the financial crisis, you had people having foreclosures again on their land, and you can't have a mortgage on a land with a croft because it would sit above it on the land registry. So you had people decrofting, and it seemed like we'd gone sort of full circle, and that more financial interests were taking over against the best interests of the people. And so I was making a film about that, about just how that way of life was being encroached upon. by greed, essentially, in many cases, and benign things like holiday homes. And I found these people who were still keeping up this tradition and were in love with it. Every year they gave up their jobs to go, and it's hard work, and they go off and stay on essentially a rocky outcrop in the middle of the ocean and hunt and pickle seabirds for 2 weeks and build them into beautiful cairns. They held on to this not as a tradition, as something they did in a contemporary sense, and it was life. and so special. And they said, of course, no to start with. I wasn't allowed to film it. Film crews were going there every year from all over the world, and we weren't to do it. And then eventually we did some filming with them about the crofting aspect of things. That was close to their heart because they were all crofters. We were invited for a pint of Guinness in the pub at the end of the day. And then he said, the leader of the Hunt Dodds said, if you can sail there yourself and look after yourselves, then you can film us. I'm not sure that they ever thought that we would get there repeatedly in our boat. It was a 20-hour sail out there in the boat. We chartered the sailing boat that I was living on and sailing around was tiny. I mean, it was not going to make it out there. It was 26 feet long. So we chartered something a little bit bigger, which repeatedly fell to pieces. The danger of charter boats. And so it was quite an adventure. We broached and capsized out there. Their boat nearly sank once, and we got to get helicopter rescued off it, and all kinds of dramas on the high seas. Tales which haven't yet fully been told. The behind the scenes was quite a story of quest, and a voyage of great personal change as well.
Well, look, I mean, I think you're right. There was a lot going on behind the scenes, but as you finished filming and were in post-production, that was when you became ill with encephalitis. What happened?
Well, yeah, after surviving the sea monsters, the last week of the edit, I thought I had a cold or a flu-y thing or something. So I said to the editor, I'm just going to take a couple of days off and knock this thing on the head. I didn't realize that it would be a bit more. Be about 400 days off. Yeah, it started like a sort of, I suppose, a toothache behind the eyeballs, and it was an unusual feeling, but it wasn't so alarming. But of course, you're not in your full faculties while these things are happening, and so it crept in. And then the next thing I knew, I woke up and I was in a hospital, and I'd been there a week. My family were all around me, looking very worried. And all my leg muscles had gone, and I had lots of drips in me and things. So in my feet, in fact, they were all going into my feet unusually because I'd been trying to take them out of my hands. So yeah, and my first instinct was I'm supposed to be in Madrid next week because I had been actually invited to the first ever kind of film workshop type thing I was ever going to do. And the nurse looked at me. She looked like she was going to cry because I didn't realize that I'd been unconscious for a week, and I certainly wasn't going to an airport anytime soon. So, yeah, it was that, and I was there for another good couple of weeks after that. I was in hospital for 3.5 weeks. I left early actually because I wanted some fresh vegetables and better food.
Well, we've spoken before, and I know when we chatted, you talked about having to kind of almost, relearn things again, learning to walk again, and you were even told at one point that you probably wouldn't ever return to work. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was really I remember from that period was I wasn't allowed to Google what I had because they wanted, I don't know, it was a very strange time of I suppose after that acute phase you don't know, you don't there's so many unknowns, and at that point I was still being pushed around in a wheelchair, and I couldn't really read. I would read the same sentence over and over again because it just wasn't sort of sticking, and my speech pointing out from the swelling, so I had a patch on one eye, and Yeah, I mean, one doctor who, let's say, his bedside manner could have been a little bit more humanitarian, just basically told me to give up and that's how it was going to be forever, and I had to accept it. To which I rebelled strongly against. I think I might have sworn quite strongly, because even in that state, I knew that was a stupid thing to say, because how can you even know? How can you know that? So I was trying to hold on to the positive thinking, and you don't know how far you can get at that point, but you're certainly not going to give up. So yeah, the learning to walk again and things like that were the most tangible. The physical bits, obviously, you can gauge when they come back, and that's reassuring. It was a while later that my mum went to an Encephalitis Society meeting, actually, and a girl there told her to tell me that the thing that had shocked her the most was how long it took to get fully better. And I think that was something really profound that stayed with me, that helped me not despair too much, because it took well over 3 years for me to get better. I mean, or 5 maybe, I don't know, but the last percentages are hard to gauge, and of course it's peaks and troughs and different frequencies of them, but probably still is. So it's but the optimism and the ability of the elasticity to reroute and to get back to things was something that was passed on to me at that stage, which gave me hope, but also gave me a realistic hope that it was going to take time. And so otherwise you would, after 1 year, you'd think this is it, but it wasn't.
Well, you're living proof that it isn't, and I know that there's many people who are going to be watching this or listening to this who are going to be reassured to know that there is life after encephalitis, which obviously is something that I've researched and written about extensively. But at what point did your mind return to filmmaking, and what was going to be your next project, which was the island in the Wales? So at what point did you turn to that mentally?
There was a really natural, not conscious plan with it, that for months I could not open a laptop and look at it for anything. I mean, I just couldn't. I couldn't have thought about doing that. And then there was, I suppose, a hunger to see if I could still do it. And then there was a sitting down and the emotional moment the first time I pushed on the computer, and because I'd still not finished editing the Guga Hunters of Ness, and the BBC were amazing. They were so patient and understanding of the predicament, and just said, give it to us when you can, which meant maybe it's going to be 2 years, who knows. So I started doing maybe 5 minutes a day, and that was all I could do. And then I'd start to get electric shock. I'd get a kind of, not like pins and needles, but sort of similar, but not as annoying as pins and needles, but like little tickles of electricity in my tips of my nose, tips of my fingers and toes and my extremities. If I drank coffee or overdid it in any way, if I was tired or run down, if I walked too much, I would get these electric shocks, and that was my signal that I needed to rest. And really, sleep was the only thing that would sort of slightly recover that. When I was in the countryside, it depended. Through the stage, I could gauge my recovery from that. But I get them for years. I really overdo it now. I still get them, but that was a good measure. So eventually, I mean, editing 10 minutes a day, it took quite a while to finish a film at that rate. But I edited for some months, and it slowly increased as I could do it. The thing is, and this was the point of electric shocks really, is that there was a natural cutoff point, so I could push myself to that point, and then it would stop. But it got more and more as time went on.
Yeah, and it's important, isn't it, to know when that point is, and that's one of the things that we talk about in encephalitis recovery, is that you can do little bits of things and then have a long rest, and then do a little bit of something and then a long rest, and then eventually the amount of time that you spend doing something expands, and the time that you need to rest kind of shrinks.
Yeah, and it's a good lesson for everyone who's overdoing it in this world. To an extent, we all need to be mindful of the impact that everything has on us as well. I mean, I felt when I went to London at one point, and it was about 9 months after I'd had encephalitis, and it was one of my first trips. We were going to record a soundtrack, And I'd been feeling okay in myself while I was in Scotland in the town and walking on the beach. And I come from a town where it was a convalescent town after the war for people recovering, and I could feel why after. And I went to London, and I could only stay awake for about 2 hours a day, because it just, the sensual impact of being there was just, I mean, there's the antenna of your system. It's just it was difficult.
Yeah. Do you think returning to work helped in any way in your recovery?
I think that there was an amount of denial and fear that my dreams had finally come true, actually. That I had been a lawyer for 5 years at that point, and I finally got a BBC commission. I mean, I'd only been a filmmaker for a few months, and I got this. It was just a fairy tale, and I'd gone off on this adventure, and it was the start of a new life. And then it just got plucked away from me at the final, in the third act of the film. You know, we were about to hand the edit over, we were nearly finished, and then boom, hit by a thunderbolt, and told that game over was, you know, what I was told by some people. So I was determined that that wasn't going to be the case, because I knew there was a chance that it wouldn't be the case. I knew there was a chance that I could get fully better. And actually, it wasn't also that I got better from the illness. It changed me in a profound way that was better than how I was before. So ultimately, the whole experience was a positive thing. But there was years in between where you're in a kind of a slightly frozen state, still recovering to get back to yourself. I always thought of the old camera, the diopters, where you have the focus and there's two semicircles, and they're like this actually, and they come together when everything's in focus. I always kind of had a sense of what I should be able to do and could see what I couldn't do, which was a sort of outer body experience in a sense, and it was a very strange. And so work in a way represented that I could gauge what I should be able to do. So I was determined to go back. But there's a scene at the beginning of the next film, which was the first time I pushed record on a camera since having encephalitis, and they told me not to work for a year, to take a year off. Well, and I kind of didn't, because I just sort of finished editing the Guga Hunters during that year. But then I went away the following March to the Faroe Islands to see if it was feasible to make this film about the pilot whale hunting. And they were also seabird hunters. We'd met these Faroese sailors while making the Guga Hunters, and they are the only other people who hunt gannets, and they're allowed because they're not in the EU. But I went up there and discovered this story that the pollution was impairing the cognitive ability of children before they were born and in the womb, and that marine pollution, that was a big part of the story I was trying to tell, was affecting people's brains as I was rebuilding my own. So there was obviously a strong connection there. And by coincidence, the doctor who'd done all the research, Dr. Palavaya, for 30 years, he'd researched his own population to discover this. He was living next door to the house I was in, so he popped over for a cup of tea, and was shocked to hear that I was recovering from encephalitis. But that film then became the carrot on the stick for me to prove to myself, or to find out if I still had it in me to make a film like that again.
So I think, Mike, also when we were chatting, you mentioned something to me around confidence, and I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about that and your recovery from encephalitis.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things to go was confidence, because you don't maybe you retreat into yourself in a way, because your short-term memory is forgetting things, you make faux pas, and you become a little bit more introverted. And I think that one of the biggest struggles for me was rebuilding that. I remember doing public speaking early on at a pitch, and I was terrified that I was going to just forget basic words, because I could remember how to talk about what I was pitching, but I might forget how to say the word milk and have to describe it as, you know, white stuff that comes out of cows, and people would be looking at you like, what are you? And from the outside you might be articulate enough, but to be walking, you're running it mentally to do it, which is exhausting. And so it's invisible in that way. And in a sense, when I still couldn't walk that well, it was easier because people could see something was wrong. And then the years after that, and also because of the career I'd chosen, because I was at the beginning of it, I was hiding a lot of that, because I wasn't sure how people would trust me with what I had to do. And so for years and years, I was trying to sort of almost keep it a secret. And that was one of the more challenging parts of the recovery, was perception. And also not really being able to say to people who don't know there's anything wrong with you that you're struggling, that you've got electric shocks in your face because you've overdone it and you need to go. I mean, it's difficult for anyone to understand unless they're going through it.
Yeah, and because I guess, like you, most people after encephalitis, in many cases, they look the same as they looked before, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was so the confidence goes, and it took time to rebuild that. Even now, public speaking, I think there's still like a little bit of something in the back of my head. Am I going to forget how to say a really normal word? But yeah, time heals, and the elasticity of the brain is an amazing thing.
You skipped over that a little bit, but The Island in the Whales was released in 2016, and as you say, it could have been, and here's what I thought it was going to be when I sat down to watch it on TV with my Sea Shepherd hoodie on and all of this. It could have been, this really contentious look at the Faroe Islanders, who are a community who still hunt pilot whales. And that does play a part in the story. But as you say, as I found out when I was watching the film, it's actually looking at this important impact of pollution on the community, and also how their relationship with the whales is affected by this. So tell us a bit more about this. Tell us about the crux of The Island and the Whales of the movie.
Well, that's it. I mean, as all these stories are, they're more complex and contradictory than we might like to squeeze them into the good guys and the bad guys in a Hollywood movie. And that had been done a lot before. There was also an astounding amount of misinformation out there about it, that it was a festival or a rites of passage to become a man, or all these things. So, but for me, the whales were the red flag in the bullfight. Those blood red bays were a way to draw people's attention to a bigger story. They were just this very visceral way to have a thin end of a wedge to get people to realize what we were doing to the planet, because we were giving all our attention to this very visually spectacle and very bloody thing. Of course, we're killing billions of animals behind closed doors, and arguably in a far more gruesome way, mechanized and all the rest. But I wasn't ever trying to change anyone's minds on the whale hunting. It's that battle is entrenched. The whalers are never going to stop whaling because someone tells them not to, and the anti-whalers are never going to change their minds from being anti-whaling. I mean, it's kind of a locked situation, that. But what was more interesting to me was that gray zone around how we do live with it. I mean, that is, on one hand, it could be said to be cruel and barbaric, but it's a local sustainable way of living. How do we live with the natural world? What is our impact upon it? And they are right in the whales. They were the messenger. They had that message in them. They were so full of mercury from us burning coal or getting gold, which God knows, getting gold is hardly an essential activity. It was they were so polluted that it was toxic and damaging the brain impairment of during fetal development or early childhood, not to mention what it's doing to those animals themselves. And PCBs and PSOFs and at least polychlorinated biphenyls and things that were completely man-made artificial substances that have a half-life of decades that lives in these things. Once that's in you, it's in you for your life. It's hideous and insidious, and for me, that was the bigger story. But normally, it's not that sexy. It doesn't get that much attention. So it felt a bit like the whales were bringing us this message in a way.
Yeah. As you say, we're killing them anyway. You know, the immediate slaughter of them by the islanders or other people that do that is almost is a distraction, almost a, you know, a kind of red herring, for want of a better word. But because we're killing them and all the other animals on the planet anyway, as a result of our behaviors as humans. Tell me a little bit, so what's happening to the islanders in terms of eating this mercury poisoned flesh of the whales then? What are they experiencing as a result?
There's nothing acute. It's just that it's across a population basis, you can see a reduction in IQ of 1 or 2 IQ points. There's all sorts of other things it can do in terms of immunity response, or perhaps there's lots of other let's just say peripheral, but I think compared to cognitive impairment, they're fairly peripheral, like a reduction in sperm count or immunity and things like that. It's this long-term low-dose exposure which was the shocking thing, and of course it's a death by 1,000 cuts, and it's what we're all sleepwalking into, with microplastics being everywhere and all these other things, is that these man-made chemicals have only been in the world, they've only existed for maybe 50, 70 years or whatever. So and if the study takes 30 years, we're just now waking up to what these things are doing and the consequences of them. So the specifics to the Faroes, I think it was interesting just that you can already map the beginning of these things, this wave that's coming, that's affecting us. Then the cognitive part was scary, obviously. For me personally, I was going through that at the time, but that what we eat in one of the most pristine places in the world could cause cognitive impairment. God knows we need every IQ point we can get right now. So well, driving it down by polluting things just seemed doubly stupid.
Well, look, I'm curious, you know, how did you build up trust with the islanders? Because, you know, especially because their traditions had drawn criticism, as we already know from animal activist groups. You know, how did you build that rapport? And actually, did the fact that you were recovering from encephalitis play a part in that at all?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, I was I drank a lot of schnapps and ate a lot of seabirds as part of the way I gained access. I wasn't meant to drink alcohol for a year, so I was a bit of a lightweight as well. That certainly. Also, the film that I'd made before, I mean, I arrived in the islands not even sure if it was even physically possible to make this film, because a whale hunt can happen in any one of 17 bays. You'd have to race there, and you really need the cooperation of the locals. And it happened by chance at the meeting of the Grundamannafélag, the Pilot Whale Hunting Association, was happening the month I was there. So they invited me along to show 5 minutes of the Guga Hunters, because they were all seabird eaters, but more fulmars and guillemots and puffins. But there's one island on the far west coast called Magennis where they do eat the gannets as well. But it's a real delicacy there, because there's a lot less nesting pairs. I think 6,000 compared to thousands on Sulaska, tens of thousands. So they don't get that many. And the man Esbern, who became a good friend, he flew over by helicopter to come into the capital to see this bit of the film. But he thought the whole film was being shown, and I felt terrible. He'd flown all this way to see the film, but in the end, they ended up showing the whole film with a Faroese guy who tried to film the Guga Hunters 2 years prior to that, but he hadn't been given permission, and he ended up standing on the stage translating the film. Live, and they watched the whole thing, and they were very skeptical, because there had been filmmakers go there saying that they were making a film about living with nature, and it turned into be activists, and they'd grabbed the engine during a whale hunt and things like this. So they were very, very wary, and they were all sitting like this at the start, and by the end they were all asking questions, and they asked a lot of questions. But yeah, being having a bit of a seafaring background, but also having filmed those seabird hunters in Scotland certainly helped. They could see what we'd done before, so people can judge things for themselves.
Right. And for people who are listening or watching the podcast, Mike and Ava are not suggesting that drinking lots of peach schnapps should form part of your recovery. So just to be clear, that's our disclaimer on this video.
I should have a disclaimer as well. It wasn't peach schnapps. It was something that tasted like petrol. That's I think it's just the schnapps without the peach. So
those schnapps, anybody? Okay. You mentioned something earlier about, I think if I understood you correctly, almost alluding to things being better despite the fact that you've had encephalitis, despite, I don't know. And many of our members who lean towards the arts and creativity do see changes in their work. So I'm curious as to whether you think encephalitis has changed you as a filmmaker. Do you see the world differently now?
Well, I always say to people when brief moments I've taught film, that 95% of doing a documentary like this isn't about the filmmaking. It's about how you see things, your relationship with the people who are in front of the camera. It's much the filmmaking is the means to the ends, really. But after, I mean, I hadn't done much of it before I had encephalitis, but my worldview changed significantly, and I kind of prayed to every god there was when I was in that first year, that if I had another chance, that I wouldn't waste it, because I really wasn't in a good way for a while. So it definitely, I appreciate being alive. I just wanted to eat the world after I got to a point where I could get up and go, and it definitely, it gave me a completely different perspective. I think you feel really grateful for that second chance, and also there's a desire to not to waste it and to do something with it. I'd already left the job that I wasn't super happy doing, so I felt like fortunate that I felt immensely grateful that I was able to still finish that film and start the other one. It would be 5 years to make that once in a while, so I didn't really know until I was sitting in the premiere in Toronto with two people who'd been through that journey with me, and one of them, someone who became a guardian angel at the Sundance Institute, Kristen, she turned to me and said, "Remember when you started this, what you were thinking you might not be able to do?" Just as the credits came up, and so it hit me that, of course, she'd known how I'd been when I started that, because by the end of that 5 years, I was in a different place. But it was important to remember that, yeah, I didn't know that I was going to be able to make that film when I started it. So,
well, we're pleased that you did. Those films were heavily influenced by the ocean and filmed on islands. Is there something about the sea and island life that's special to you, that draws you?
I mean, I grew up with that. My father was a seaman, and I was in the RNLI and the Scottish Sailing Squad when I was 11 years old. I was always sailing, and every summer we'd go off sailing around, and so it was my comfort zone, was being on a boat, and that was I guess why I felt like I should do that. But I also, probably after being a lawyer in London, wanted to have an excuse to go spoofing off around the west coast of Scotland on a boat, trying to find a story at the same time. Was a nice way to do it. So it was a return to roots in a way, but also a yearning for community probably follows through a lot of my work. I think people can be very scattered these days, and we seek that. When you're in it, you want out of it, and when you're out of it, you want into it. It's one of the many contradictions.
Well, a lesson that I think we've learnt over the last 14 months, perhaps more than ever, in terms of the importance of other people in our lives. Look, where can people go to watch The Island and the Whales, or any of your other movies? Is that something people, after watching this or hearing this podcast, is there somewhere they can go?
Yeah, they're both on Vimeo in the UK. They are also on iTunes and Amazon and things. So perhaps not in the UK, but Vimeo certainly in the UK. They're on those. They're on there, and Amazon, I believe, as well.
Your next documentary is called The Poetry of Cowboys. Now, that sounds to me like it's set on dry land. What can you tell us about that? Do cowboys even do poetry? Is that a thing?
Yeah, it was a surprise, I think, to some of the cowboys too. I was driving from San Francisco to Utah, and I stopped in this town called Elko in Nevada. And the next morning I woke up and there was a poster for the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering, and I thought, wow, that could be, that's what is that? It's a great American adventure, and there's some wonderful characters in it, that's for sure.
Well, I can't wait to see it. You know, Mike, I don't know, just sitting here talking with you for a little while, your life seems to be this extraordinary list of coincidences, at least to me.
There's a fair amount of serendipity, that's for sure, which I'm grateful for. I was kind of catapulted out of bed after I had encephalitis. It definitely propelled me forward, that the recovery kept going in a way.
Well, look, I've just got a couple of questions as we draw to a close. I've taken so much of your time, but what's next for you and for Intrepid Cinema, Mike?
Well, I have been writing for a while. It was different. People have said that I've done a documentary about my recovery from encephalitis and things, but I think for me, I was interested in exploring something slightly beyond my own personal experience of it, but using my personal experience of that existential moment that you are your memories, and how we interact with that, and how we build ourselves through that, and for me then the route back to self was a big part of it. So I wanted to make a film about someone else. So I'm writing a fictional version of it, but interweaving my personal experiences of it. And yeah, I hope to start writing that as soon as I've finished making the cowboy movie. So it's fictional, but it's maybe more real than the documentaries in a way.
We've already chatted a bit about this behind the scenes, haven't we? So
yeah, I'm excited that we might cooperate on aspects of it, and so that's good.
Yeah, watch this space, everybody. So
it's set in the 18th century Highlands. It's a Jacobite tale, so we're Eva and I are going time traveling.
We're going to be like Doctor Who. That's all for another podcast anyway. But look, is there anything else that you'd like to say before we bring the podcast to a close, Mike?
Well, I would like to say thank you to you for all you're doing, because it can be a very lonely and isolated experience recovering from something like this. And it was always a great comfort to have the information that you were providing, and just the sense of community again. And I know it helped me, and it helped my mum a lot as well. And in some ways, the people around you go through more than you do as well. So there's a lot that you help with, and so thank you.
Oh, thank you. It touched me a lot when we spoke last time. I know you said you told your mum that you were going to have a Zoom call with me, and she was super excited for you.
Well, just after that as well, I found the cookbook. I'd forgotten I had the Encephalitis Society cookbook here as well.
Who knew? Look, we've covered an awful lot. We're deeply, deeply grateful to you for taking the time to chat with us, Mike. The Encephalitis Society services remain unaffected. So if any of you are listening to this or watching this and you need any support or information, our teams remain at your service. Go to encephalitis.info for contact details, or you can chat online or send an email or whatever you need to do. As always, if you can support our work, It's a really challenging time for us as a result of COVID, but please visit encephalitis.info/donate. Most of all, keep washing your hands, keep your distance, stay safe, and if you can, get vaccinated. Oh, and please don't forget to watch The Island in the Whales. You won't regret it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.